Okay, good afternoon, everyone. The people who is attending in person and the people who is connected via Zoom and Woha. So today we will start with another conference on data, issues, and perspectives. For this session, we will have two speakers. And before that, I will just want to remind to the people who is connecting via Zoom that you can provide your questions in the Q&A session. So by the end of the two presentations, we can have a discussion. Oh, okay. So I'm going to give the word to our first speaker. This is Scott Doham. He is a postgraduate research student at the Department of Politics, International Relations and Philosophy at the University of London. And he will be providing a presentation on attitudes to public sector use of data, a literature review. So this will be it. So the floor is yours, Scott.
Yep. Okay, thank you. You can see the slides and everything. Yep. Okay, so this is my literature review of attitudes to public sector, particularly council use of data. This was done for funded by Surrey County Council around London because they're trying to improve their use of data. Residents' personal data. Okay, so yeah, I can link the full report later if anyone needs it. But the key points are with regard to attitudes to data use generally, is that Britons think that health and the economy are the greatest issues facing the UK, and also the greatest opportunities for data use to benefit the public. The UK public mostly agree that data use is useful. However, they are slightly more negative regarding harms and accountability for data misuse by organizations. And here's some key evidence from my report. This graph looks quite complicated, but the takeaway is that the more an area of life is located at the top right of this graph, the more people think in polling that it's the most important and also the most useful of an area for data use to benefit the UK. So we have the economy and health in the top right there. Yeah, so if you want to do something in those areas, you probably have more leeway to use the public's personal data. Okay, so these are more public attitudes which have remained consistent from 2020 that organizations should align their practices with. So the top three, I'll always just read out the top three. So what people want most with regard to their data use is the right to access their personal information, the right to be informed about the collection and use of their personal information, and the right to restrict the processing of particular personal information. So across all the reports that I did my literature review on, these are a list of the demographic traits that predict greater positivity on many questions of data use. And it's just, these are all pretty, as you would expect. There's just a couple that are surprising that I'll explain. So higher socioeconomic status people are more positive towards their personal data use. Younger people, Black and Asian people. So that is surprising, like BAME people, because we hear a lot about how they can be disenfranchised with like institutions. So it's quite surprising that they're more positive towards data use. and these institutions using their data. Males are more positive. Parents and carers are more positive towards data use, generally, but also specifically in regards to their children's data, which is what I found quite surprising. You'd think they'd be more wary of organizations using their children's data, but they're actually more supportive of it. So those living in urban areas are more supportive. Again, BAME people, white people, but only regarding data use by their local GP, the police, and financial services. Older people, age 65 plus, and those living with a long-standing health condition. These two factors are only in relation to health and well-being data, because obviously, those people are going to be more amenable to organizations using their health data to help them out with health problems. Those living in more affluent areas are more positive. Those who have positive views of a council, if we're talking about council data use. And also those who find the council trustworthy, feel a strong sense of community in their local area, feel involved in local democracy, and believe they can influence decisions in their local area. Those last few are all in regard to council data use. So that makes sense. Okay, so more attitudes to data use generally. If we look at the specific institutions that people are okay with using their data, it's primarily emergency services. So National Health Service, your local GP, the police. And then in the middle somewhere, depending on the study, you have national government and local government. And then around there, you also have just all your private companies, your social media platforms, and so on, are not too trusted with data, if you can believe it. And then the particular concerns that people have with organizations using their data is primarily that data will not be held securely and could be hacked or stolen. Data will be sold on to other organizations for companies to profit from. And data will be used for surveillance purposes. Okay, so attitudes to data use and sharing by the public sector and partners more specifically. So I just talked about that one, but yeah, this is just the same kind of information, but from another study. So what do people want? What rights do they want with regard to their data? So the top three are the right to access my personal information, the right to be informed about the collection and use of my personal information, and the right to restrict the processing of personal information. People are worried about their data being shared or passed on to third parties, being a victim of fraud and scams, and misuse of data, including by third parties. So some more issues people have are personal information being used for scams, being stolen, and children's personal information being used online. So reasons for trust levels. The summary here is that UK citizens are wary of the risk of data use, and concerns have increased in recent years due to more high-profile cases of data misuse. So the main reasons for people's level of trust. So those with a higher level of trust, they will cite good legislation protecting data use. They trust the organization, and they've had good previous experiences. So they've never had any problems before. Those are the top three. So the reasons amongst those with low trust levels in data use is that they sell the information to third parties, data hacking, and concerns about data misuse, not being sure about what organizations do with data. And with regard to media coverage, so I think 40% of the public report seeing a story about data use recently, and of those, the news story is negative primarily. And so this is because of stories of data misuse by social media companies like Facebook/Meta, TikTok, and Instagram. Also, there's stories about health data and the NHS, and changing laws around the General Data Protection Regulation, that's GDPR, and cookies. So specifically, the hot topic area is artificial intelligence as well. And so the public are generally neutral to just slightly optimistic about AI use, but again, very wary of the risks. So most, 89% of UK citizens have heard about artificial intelligence, and 46% of respondents report being able to give at least a partial explanation of what AI is. So 58% had moderate expectations for the use of AI in society. Just 21% were negative, and just 16% are positive. So people think AI would be good for doing day-to-day tasks, healthcare, and how easy it is to save money on services and goods. Those are the top three. So next, I was asked to look at methods used, especially longitudinal, and showing views improving due to work undertaken by an organization. So as I showed there, the most reliable research involves national annual polling and uses simple regression analysis for determining statistically significant attitude change between demographics and over time. Meanwhile, most common for smaller local samples are questionnaires, focus groups, and interviews. And some councils are currently conducting longitudinal research using bespoke citizen panels annually to track various improvements due to their work. However, of these initiatives seen currently, no updates have been published yet, with findings compared across multiple waves. So we're still waiting on that. So public attitudes towards data use is an emerging area of research. Yeah, so yeah, there's some examples in the report of various local organizations doing questionnaires. But the big main example in this area is Camden Council. They appear to be leading the way on citizen engagement of data ethics. They've committed holding a resident panel annually, ensuring data use adheres to their new data charter, which they also did deliberatively with their citizens. So that's in terms of rationale, risk, and impact of privacy and ethics. So that's ensuring there is public comment or challenge on their practices. The panels are independent and representative of Camden residents, but they also contain experts in data law, ethics, and so on. Also councillors and council officers for support. And these panels have access to information on council's data projects. So Camden Council outlined longitudinally measurable targets to demonstrate improved use of data. These targets were about reducing inequality. I don't believe this was defined, and reducing data use complaints, publishing the numbers on their website. And they plan to conduct annual reviews to monitor measurable objectives transparently. I believe they're just doing their second wave of this now. So I'm looking forward to those findings. Okay, so comparisons to public bodies' understanding of acting ethically with data. So compared to those public attitudes discussed, public bodies are far more positive about data use. Where the public can be wary of data use, public bodies emphasize the ethical duty to utilize data. So how public bodies understand all this is limited. Our knowledge of it is limited due to its kind of covert nature. Researchers face difficulty dislodging successful freedom of information requests to find out what predictive analytic systems councils use. So, for example, they can use databases and AI systems to work out where crime is most likely to happen based on people's personal information. But yeah, there's a disparity in the public body's understanding and the public's understanding of acting ethically. So there's this one study, Densick et al. They did 27 semi-structured interviews with public sector workers, working with 6 of these predictive analytic applications in 6 local areas. And they found that the public bodies were very positive, and what they do is they've highlighted the efficiency gains necessitated by austerity, and also there's infamous cases of not data sharing, like including long-term child abuse cases, like the deaths of Baby P, where social services were not fully integrated with their data sharing, and babies tend to die without oversight of their parents to stop this from happening. Whereas in this study, there were civil society groups representing the public, and they were emphasizing concerns over the extent of data collection, who gets to see data, and the lack of transparency. And so the Camden Council manager explains the aim of achieving the golden view of their population, whereby they create a holistic profile of each resident collated from all locally available data sets across health, education, housing, crime, and so on. Which, yeah, I don't, that's quite a new thing. I don't know how happy people would be towards that, but yeah, it happens in some places. Okay, so my last point is on recommendations. So current studies have a few limitations that could be improved upon in further research to increase reliability. So I wrote about several limitations in the report. But the main one I would like to focus on is that there's this thing called the privacy paradox, which means there's a discrepancy between how much citizens claim to be concerned about data use in research and how easy they disclose their data in reality, just for convenience or desire to access services. Therefore, citizens may be more open to data use than attitudinal research suggests. So for future research, I would say that perhaps there could be less self-reports, so people just saying what they think about stuff from surveys and focus groups, because these are abstract, they're relatively unreliable, patchy, if you're relying on people's memories and intentions, and they're only hypothetical. Moreover, ultimately, there's little perceived risk of participants to claim that they are comfortable with their data being used and shared in attitudinal research, because in that moment, they are not actually consenting to data use, which could go wrong. The data could be stolen or so on. So there's no real stakes, there's no skin in the game. So instead, I would suggest that research can take on more of an observed behavior, experimental design. So if possible, residents could instead be asked to disclose data or consent to its use and sharing in a realistic scenario, however it would usually be done. So, for example, via post, email, phone, or website, and so on. And so people could be given something like a realistic but mock consent form, so they think it's real, from, in this case, Surrey County Council. And then it could have many tick boxes for lists of data, uses of said data, and organizations the council may be considering sharing data between, regardless of whether or not the council actually has that particular data or intends to share it with such organizations. But the point is to work out what people would accept. And maybe afterwards, willing participants could be asked why they did or did not consent to inform improvements. But the point is that with questionnaires and focus groups, only people who are accepting of data collection will participate by definition. So this way, if you can track the number of people who don't accept filling out such a form, so you don't have that self-selection bias. And then, yeah, after there could be a debrief where you explain that it was just a mock consent form for research purposes to ascertain preferences more reliably. So this is, people's actual preferences that are displayed in that moment by ticking boxes where they actually have to think about the risks, rather than just a hypothetical, oh yeah, I'd be okay with it. But it doesn't really matter ultimately what they say, because it's just a questionnaire or so on, usually. So yeah, you can get in touch with me for the full report, or we might be able to link it somewhere. But yeah, the full detail is there if you need it. Yeah, hopefully this can go towards actually helping out councils and so on, in real, out there in the real world. And so yeah, thank you very much for that. Yep, that's everything.
Thank you very much, Scott, for your presentation. Oh, okay, before moving to the next presentation, I would like to remind all the people that is joining us through Zoom or Wova that you can provide your questions in the Q&A. These questions will be discussed by the end of the session. Okay, so now we have a second speaker, which is Natalia Grincheva. Dr. Grincheva is an internationally recognized expert in innovative forms and global trends in contemporary museology, digital diplomacy, and international cultural relations. She is a program leader BA of the BA Arts Management in LaSalle College of the Arts. Welcome, Dr. Grincheva.
Hello, everybody. You can hear me well, right? So it's a pleasure to share my presentation with you today. Thank you for the invitation to join this very exciting conference. I hope my presentation today will be quite engaging and will generate a lot of interesting questions in the very end, which I'm happy to discuss, both during the conference and also beyond. So my presentation will share my research development, focusing on new computational methodologies that tap on the open data resources and employ automatic data aggregation tools to inform decision-making processes in international cultural relations, building, and cultural diplomacy. So I will start by overviewing existing tools in soft power measurements, and then we'll move to present a new solution that was developed to overcome numerous shortcomings in the computational soft power research. So let's start with some basics definitions. Cultural diplomacy as a practice and as a subfield of national foreign policy emerged in the midst of the Cold War between the United States and Soviet Russia. And initially it was defined by the United States Department of State in 1959 as the direct and enduring contact between people of different nations to help create a better climate of international trust and understanding in which official relationships can operate. So if not mitigating geopolitical conflicts, the ultimate goals of cultural diplomacy include creating a positive view of the nation in the eyes of the foreign publics and facilitating a stronger cooperation or creating political alliances. So in the past 2 decades, cultural diplomacy started to be conceptualized through the notion of soft power. Coined by Professor Joseph Nye, soft power refers to intangible forms of power such as culture, ideology, and institutions that allow countries to achieve their foreign policy objectives. So in the context of knowledge-based global economies, soft power is a more sophisticated tool to influence international politics by contrast to military or economic coercion. So in the past decades, the concept of soft power has gained a stronger international popularity. The extent of a nation's soft power is increasingly subject to data-driven measurements with the unfolding processes of increasing datafication. So datafication refers to a process through which social interaction acquires a new digital online dimension, generating quantified data, allowing for real-time tracking and predictive analysis. And this creates conditions for more rigorous assessment of the diplomatic and soft power impacts, which have long remained a very weak point of diplomacy, because it was at the same time being a central concern of many national governments. So in the past, the majority of cultural diplomacy actors relied heavily on the descriptive accounts of diplomatic outputs, anecdotal evidences, and sharing best practices. However, with the rise of the internet, mobile communications, the datafication process have considerably enriched the diplomatic evaluation activities, offering new methods to measure global public engagements. So the use of data in policy making and diplomacy measurements transforms both the decision-making process as well as communication of policies to the masses. For example, in the past decades, data-driven measurements applied to evaluate soft power of countries gained a significant popularity, with many ranking systems produced by national governments and private actors. You can see some of them on the screen right now, and the most powerful among them in terms of the global recognition is, of course, Soft Power Authority Index. So in other words, the Portland Index, it measures soft power of selected countries by using over 75 metrics across 6 sub-indices of data. And since 2010, it measures soft power for as many as 30 countries on the annual basis and earned a reputation of one of the most widely consulted indices among practitioners worldwide. For many countries, the Portland Annual Report is actually an important indicator of their global performance, and frequently nation states take their drop-down scores as a direct call for improvements. So, however, Soft Power Authority was severely criticized in academic scholarship for simplifying the understanding of soft power measured only in quantitative terms, and for data colonization that engenders status anxiety of different actors on the global map. However, the scholarship, with a lot of criticism about Soft Power Authority, doesn't go beyond a mere criticism of the failures of benchmarking systems. Addressing these gaps, my own research creation projects in the past few years took a more constructive approach. So, intending to overcome fundamental problems existing in previously developed ranking systems, I embarked on a creative practice research journey that resulted in a pilot web application, Museum Soft Power Map. Specifically, I collaborated with the Australian Centre of the Moving Image in Melbourne to create a pilot dynamic application that can measure and demonstrate the institutional power of attractions across the globe. Let me very briefly to show you a video demo of this application. At the University of Melbourne, we've created a way for the first time to visually map and measure the soft power of museums. We have collaborated with the Australian Centre for the Moving Image to globally map ACMI's resources, outputs, and outcomes. The system maps the data in 5 layers. The first layer maps ACMI International Collection appeal power based on culture and language. The more intense the green, the greater the appeal power. As you can see, the collection appeals strongly in North America, Europe, and the Asia Pacific. The second layer is online engagement power, and it maps ACMI's online global audiences. The varied intensity of the blue indicates that the majority of these audiences are coming from developed countries in Europe and North America. The Asia Pacific appears relatively untapped. If we move down, we come to the global connectivity power layer. And here we map ACMI's relationship with 180 organizations around the world. We can see that ACMI is strongly connected with museums in the United States and many European countries. Its relationships in the Asia Pacific are still emerging. The next layer, local engagement power, maps the international tours of ACMI exhibitions. It correlates visitation data with multiple variables across different sets of data. Finally, we have the Melbourne engagement power layer that maps ACMI's local audiences. Here, a map of Melbourne is divided in 200 postcodes. We can see from the intensity of the green that the majority of ACMI's audiences come from the central area in the city. So there you have it. ACMI mapped across various dimensions of soft power, providing the museum with a key information for strategic planning and development. So how is this application different from other dashboards like Soft Power Authority? First, the dynamic web application applied a finer grained data to represent institutional players who generate the power of attractiveness on the global stage. Focusing on museums as actors of soft power, the project revealed that measuring soft power of a whole country is very much misleading. Country or city-wide evaluations do not consider the multifaceted and complex nature of different and very often competing actors within a specific national or regional community. By contrast to highly bureaucratic and slow government organizations, non-state actors such as museums, for instance, could be more dynamic and responsive to changes in the unpredictable international climate. A good example is the leadership of Neil McGregor, a former director of the British Museum, who mediated high-level diplomatic situations to provide first aid to cultural institutions and communities in major international conflicts. For instance, during the Iraq War, which started in 2003, when the United States and British allies invaded the country, it was the British Museum that saved the main repository of national archaeological treasures of Iraq from complete destruction. When the Iraq National Museum was descended upon by looters, MacGregor telephoned the Prime Minister of Great Britain, who had American tanks deployed in front of the museum to secure it. So during the following week, the British Museum curators traveled to Baghdad to help their Iraqi colleagues with conservations and first recovery aid. So second, the project employed geovisualization as integrated approach. It allowed to meaningfully combine different methods of soft power explorations, including assessment of soft power capacities or resources. And in many cases, this benchmarks, dashboards usually stopped at that particular point, just measuring the resources of soft power. So second, evaluations of outputs, and this relates to different activities that are going on the global level. The next level is network analysis that measures the strength and durability of relationships established between different actors. And finally, measuring audiences' perceptions. So the dynamic web application provided an inductive platform to explore soft power as a process, enabling and an investigation of data from different stages of soft power conversion process. So finally, various soft power dashboards represent soft power as an omnipresent force equally affecting people living in different social, economic, political, and cultural locales. Soft power authority, for instance, doesn't account for countries' soft power reach and strength in different geographic areas. For example, the Portland Index erroneously assumes that people living, for example, in South Africa, in China, or even in different parts of China, such as Hong Kong or Taiwan, like or dislike, let's say, United States, the same degree or extent. So understanding soft power not as a constanter, but as an important variable that dynamically changes its value on the global map, the application shifted away the attention from a high competition in soft power performance to exposing and exploring one's own weaknesses in different geographical zones. So this approach stresses that there is no winners or losers of soft power, but rather there are multiple complex factors that shape soft power conversion process from resources to outcomes, depending on specific local challenges and opportunities. So while the geovisualization approach of Museum Soft Power Map inverted and reconfigured the soft power evaluation framework, overcoming many of its weaknesses, the application is still a subject for criticism. In the academic literature, for example, geovisualization is often criticized for presenting information in a distinctively positivist way, with technical barriers to integrate quantitative and qualitative data in order to generate new knowledge. In response to this critique, the project employed grounded visualization as a recursive and reflexive set of practices drawing on both qualitative and quantitative research, in which data gathering, analysis, and presentations are conducted through multiple iterations in a quiet, fluid manner. So developing the geovisualization application demonstrated that not all collected data could be meaningfully quantified, of course. The project employed a qualitative analysis of the institutional historical records and insights and incorporated the dimension of digital storytelling that allowed for a more nuanced and accurate presentation of details. So specifically, the dynamic application features multiple hyperlinked narratives and storylines that trace Australian Centre of the Moving Image traveling exhibitions, describe their multicultural programs, and map international partnerships across different continents. So the project also incorporated elements of reflexive design, embracing the subjective nature of data visualization. And this was possible through partnerships with multiple stakeholders of the project, such as academics from the University of Melbourne and most recently from the University of Oxford, specifically Digital Diplomacy Research Centre. So last year in 2022, the project significantly advanced by employing critical digital practice to experiment with data collected from our multiple participating museums to build data to power prototype, a new mapping solution for assessing and predicting the soft power impact of cultural institutions. So the development of the mapping platform happened through a series of international online research sessions, webinars, and datathons, which brought together museum professionals, policymakers, digital creators from Europe and Asia Pacific. And such a design of the project opened a discussion space with around 200 registered museum professionals from different parts of the world sign up for each online session to explore the potential of technologies to translate museum collections metadata, audiences analytics, as well as international exhibitions and programs insights into meaningful narratives. So the project engaged around 25 direct collaborations representing major museums from the UK, Australia, and Singapore, including Victoria and Albert Museum in London, Asia Civilization Museum in Singapore, and the Australian Museum in Sydney. And these partnerships ensured a community-driven research that solicited critical feedback from different stakeholders to avoid subjective biases usually inherited in data-intensive mapping. So the new data to power prototype moved forward from labor-intensive data collection and analysis research to an automated solution by adding more dynamic data mining and aggregation, as well as by tapping into open access data. Let me share with you that, for example, Museum Soft Power Map, the first pilot application, was developed with the help and input of 17 research assistants. So for this one, we only had two research coordinators from Melbourne and from London to help us with the data coordination. So the prototype developed a timeline allowing stakeholders to track their audience's development in different geolocations in different time periods. And finally, the prototype advanced the visualization software by employing machine learning and artificial intelligence to analyze patterns of cultural engagement to predict soft power. So finally, and the most important, the prototype advanced from a single museum application. You remember the first pilot is just about one institution with the Australian Centre of the Moving Image. And the prototype is actually is about online service for cultural institutions as a dynamic mapping software for universal use across different organizations. Before I start my demo of this prototype, let me share a short video that will provide some information about this mapping system. The size of our digital universe is doubling every 2 years. While we live in data overload, a meaningful analysis of data remains a complex task for many organizations. There is a need in data visualization tools that could transform mere raw data into power of storytelling. Data to Power prototype is born with this exact goal. First, it automates organizational tasks of massive data aggregation and analysis. Second, it creates simple yet informative and interactive visualizations. Data to Power automatically aggregates data from open sources via API. It makes a laborious task of data monitoring and update a matter of a button click. It also correlates various data sets into a single interactive view, thus creating a tool for a complex multi-layered mapping. You can annotate, categorize data, and adjust their weights in developing indices. You can also compare multiple data sets by creating timelines across institutional data views. The system works equally well with dynamic big data and with small data collected manually. Finally, Data to Power solves issues around data confidentiality. It automatically translates raw data into indices and visualizes them through color coding. When data literacy becomes a matter of organizational survival, Data to Power offers a valuable visualization platform. It is designed to help with data-intense analysis, strategic planning, and communication. So in my example today, in my demonstration of the system, I draw on the data shared by the Science Museum Group in London, who participated in the development of this prototype. Science Museum Group, as you all might know, is the world's leading group of science museums, consisting of the 5 British institutions with 380,000 objects and archives available online for exploration and research, with a collection spanning their origins across the world. So science museums have developed strong international partnerships with cultural organizations around the world, and is an established non-state actor of cultural diplomacy. To map the attraction power of the museum, we created 3 layers of soft power conversion process, moving from resources to outputs. And they include collection reach power that maps cultural assets or resources that can generate soft power, digital engagement power that visualizes global communication outputs that manifest in online audience reach, and finally, local engagement power that assesses the attraction power of traveling programs and traveling exhibitions. I will now go ahead and explain the rationale for creating each of these layers. So every organization involved in international cultural relations or diplomacy draws on the power of its cultural assets to develop international links and partnerships. For example, heritage artifacts and collections connect museums to cultural communities of their origin, and they become important assets in cultivating international cultural relations through loans, repatriation activities, exchange projects, and co-curated exhibitions. So addressing this task, collection reach power layer correlates collections geographic diversity data with digital and physical audiences mobility insights to expose areas on the global map where collection items might have a greater reach and potential appeal to local audiences. First, it aggregates data from collections API by searching the collection for the geolocation information of each of the objects. Second, it calculates the digital diversity index for each country. And this index shows how the country is represented by this particular organization in its feeds in different social media channels like YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook. And finally, the collection reach power index includes open access data of various social demographic variables that point to what extent audiences in each geolocation are able to interact with the digital museum and its collection. So while mapping cultural appeal is important, understanding how it translates into actual digital audiences reach around the world is the next step forward to assess organizational attraction power. And to address the task, we created this digital engagement power layer that maps a scope of online audiences coming from each country while highlighting the actual engagement happening in online museum spaces. This layer relies on the data automatically aggregated from Google Analytics. Another important component that constitutes the mapping is analytics collected from social media channels, also that can be aggregated via API. And to put the platform analytics data into the context, the layer correlates all this institutional data with the audience's profile in each country in terms of the potential audience scope and its digital mobility. So while mapping potential appeal and assessing actual digital engagement is helpful, the question still remains, to what extent could we rely on these assessments when it comes to understanding and even predicting what will happen when we actually bring our programs to a particular city in a foreign country? So what attraction power can our efforts generate in a specific cultural, economic, social, and political context? Challenging ourselves with this question, we created the local engagement power layer that actually mapped the Superbugs exhibition of the Museum Science Group that traveled many countries and many cities, including China, India, Russia, Argentina, and the list goes on. So local engagement power layer draws on multiple aggregated data sets across several key indices. And the first one is the urban context data. It is represented through two aggregated indices. On the one hand, it's a global exposure, and on the other hand, it's cultural infrastructure. So the second is the museum context and exhibition engagement metric that relates the ticket sales, on-site visitation, social media analytics, pointing at the hosting museum local popularity and global visibility and the actual audience response to that traveling program or exhibition. And finally, online engagement aggregated index is based on two variables. First, it's a Google Analytics, and second, it's Google Trends data that reveals the exhibition topic popularity among local urban audiences. So let me now show you the visualization and how it works, and I will play it live. So I hope you can see it on the screen. So yeah, let me, we are right now looking at the Science Museum group for a soft power visualization, and we are in the collection Rich Power. So as I already mentioned, this layer is about understanding where the collection of this particular museum would make a much stronger impact around the world. So the intensity of the yellow color on the map indicates all those countries where this collection would appeal the most to the audience. For example, we can see it's in Europe, North America, and also actually a lot of countries in the Asia Pacific region. So for example, if we go to India, we can say that the collection Rich Power is very, very high. It's 94. And this score is calculated by correlating two types of data. On the one hand, we can see that there are a lot of objects that come from India that contributes to the collection of the Museum Science Group, and that adds up to the total score of 94. Also, it's not about just having these objects in the collections. It's also about communicating them and communicating the value of these objects in social media. So we can see that there is a lot of Twitter mentions happening and YouTube mentions of these objects. So they are all promoted. And also, if we look at the potential audience scope, we can see, of course, there are many people potentially who could engage with all these interesting stories, narratives, and collections that come from the Science Museum Group. And the digital mobility of the population is in the middle, so it's pretty okay. So it's all adds to their score. Let me now go to the online engagement power. So this layer shows and highlights where the actual online audiences come from, and the intensity of this orange red color indicates all those countries. Again, not surprisingly, it's North America, Europe, countries with very high digital mobility. And again, we can see in the Asia Pacific region, not so much engagement, but still we can see again the highlight of India, Australia. So interesting with the China. So the China online engagement power reaches 54, which is not very high, considering that potential audience scope is one of the biggest around the world. So the digital mobility of the population in China is also very high, with a very high internet penetration rate in different parts of China and mobile usages. But of course, we can see that their online visitation and especially social media engagement, you can see is just 0 here. Google Analytics score is 34, and this is in 2021. If we move back to 2017, it was even less. It was only 13. So it shows us that in the pandemic time, actually the visitation from Chinese audiences, their online resources or Museum Science Group, increased dramatically. So let me now move to the local engagement power layer that actually are, we have two exhibitions here. Superbugs is the actual measurements And Hunting the Vaccine is that new exhibition that Museum Science Group just developed, and they launched it in India just in November last year. So in terms of the superbugs, we, for example, can compare. It traveled to Buenos Aires. So, and it also traveled to India, to several cities, for example, we can compare with Mumbai. So, like I said, this is the most complex, index that correlates multiple data sets, including urban global exposure, how global, how diverse they are hosting city of this exhibition. And in comparison between, for example, Buenos Aires and Mumbai, we can see that Buenos Aires reaches higher scores and it outperforms Mumbai on many criteria in terms of their migrants, tourist arrivals, foreign students living in the cities. So all this data corresponds to our to showing how diverse and how global is the city. In terms of the urban cultural infrastructure, that shows how cultural appealing the city is, how cultural, interesting the whole environment for the traveling exhibition. Again, Buenos Aires outperforms Mumbai on many factors in terms of how many urban cultural institutions exist in the city, in terms of urban attractions, in terms of their urban higher education institutions and so on. So another factor that for Buenos Aires being a better place to host this exhibition and to reach more audiences is museum context, which in Buenos Aires, there was a science center, the National Science Center that hosts the exhibition. And this science center enjoys large on-site and online visitations and a huge engagement on social media, which is not necessarily the case with Mumbai. But we can also see that in terms of that actual engagement that happened with the exhibition, that Mumbai outperforms Buenos Aires on many factors. There were more, engagement on social media because of the exhibition. There were more audiences are coming to the exhibition, also because the center in Mumbai actually took extra efforts to bring the exhibition beyond their institutional walls, and they organized different community events outside of the museum that actually helped them to increase the numbers of audiences reached. And in terms of the urban online engagement, the results you can also see. Now, on the Google Trends, for example, it's evidence that in Mumbai, people would Google more frequently the title of the exhibition Superbugs, and there was no the same happening in Buenos Aires. And there are people who are, search information online and connected to the Science Museum group from Mumbai were actually high. So let me right now return back to my slides. And finish my presentation. So yes, just would like to stop here to allow some time for questions. And in conclusions, I wanted to know that even though this data mapping system in this example is used to visualize attraction power of museums, it could be adopted for mapping different data across different types of institutions. For example, I'm currently working with my colleagues from the UK on developing a research project on mapping the cultural value of World Heritage. And I'm happy to continue a conversation further to explore more exciting opportunities of using this tool for different research projects. So please feel free to connect with your questions and ideas. Thank you very much for your attention today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Grincheva, and congratulations for this impressive tool. I think we don't have questions in Zoom or either in WOBA, but I would like to open for questions so the people who is attending in person, if any of you would like to ask a question to any of the two speakers we had today. Yes, we have a question here. Just a second.
Mere curiosity. Thank you, Natalia, for this presentation, and also to the last speaker for the presentation. This is a question from a non-expert. I have no expertise in museology, either I will say this sort of data collection, but I'm very curious because I work on gender, and I think like it's inevitable just to ask this kind of questions in terms of gender is a cross-cutting topic. But especially in this data collection, I don't know if this applies for museology and for what your project is about, but I think it's very systemic how data collection it's being done now. So I just want to know if you have any kind of, I will say, protection or any kind of layer on like the kind of data that you are collecting, that if this data has any kind of biases towards gender or race or ethnicity or something else, if you have any kind of filter or any kind of measure or tool to protect this, I will say like this tool from being biased. I think like that's the question in every tool that applies data collection or AI. So that's my question. If you have anything related to that, or what are your suggestions for people who have like same tools, not specifically on museology, but in other kind of topics, that how can they shelve or protect their data collection from these structural biases that we sometimes have when collecting data? Thank you.
Thank you so much for these excellent questions. And indeed, we faced this kind of problems when we developed this computational tools. So I would say that the only way we can protect ourselves from structural biases in the data collections is just transparency, is just being transparent on the sources of the data and the provenance of the data, who collected the data, when, how, why, what are the methodologies. This is the only way. When we first developed this Museums of Power Map pilot project, like I mentioned, I have 17 research assistants who would go and who would collect data from different national government censuses from 250 countries around the world. This is a very laborious task. And of course, we cannot guarantee that each of the censuses, provides the information without any biases or without any structural errors that are already encoded in the data. We do not have this capacity and capability to check all this data. The only way to highlight that any kind of data visualization or any work with the data is the subject to these mistakes, errors, and biases is to be transparent. And because of that, for example, when we developed this pilot tool for the Australian Center for the Moving Image, we very quickly understood that the application didn't allow us to show all the depth of the data information or metadata on the data used for this application to reach the audiences. That's why there was a need to move forward from this single museum app to create this data to power prototype that actually has an interface where somebody who is working with the data has all the control of what is data being aggregated automatically or by hand, just collecting manually, to code all the provenance data, to code all the information where the data is being taken. So this is the only way, because what this tool does, it doesn't necessarily check the quality of the data. It just aggregates it from reliable open sources. For example, we work with a lot with the World Bank data API that allows us to automatically aggregate data sources, for example, for population, the age groups, mobility of the population, tourists, international visas, all this kind of data automatically via API aggregate into the tool. So we can, take the metadata and encode into the interface so everybody could have a clear understanding what this kind of data and how it could be used. So I haven't, come across any better way so far, but this is an excellent question. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to the two speakers we had today. We hope you can join us in future events. And thank you very much for joining us. This will be the end of the session.